This is the 1341 Seaman Boys explanation of the ranges of motion of the hip, knee, and talar curl joint during the phases of gait. So we're going to look at the hip first. During initial contact, the hip is flexed at 20 degrees. Then as you move towards loading response, the hip is flexed at 15 degrees because it's moving toward extension. Then at mid stance, you're at 0 degrees of flexion, still moving towards extension. At terminal stance, you're at 5 to 10 degrees of extension, moving towards more extension. Then as you get to pre-swing, you're still in 5 to 10 degrees of extension, but now you're moving towards flexion. Then at initial swing, it flips to 20 degrees of flexion of the hip. Now we will talk about the knee. At initial contact, the knee has 0 degrees of extension, moving towards flexion. At loading response, there is 15 degrees of flexion in the knee, still moving towards flexion. Then as you get to mid stance, you have 0 degrees of flexion extension, moving toward more extension. At terminal stance, you're continuing to move towards more extension, but you are still in 0 degrees of flexion and extension. Then as you get towards pre-swing, you are moving towards flexion and you are in 30 degrees of knee flexion. Then during initial swing, you have 60 degrees of knee flexion, moving towards more flexion throughout the swing phase. Now we will look at the talar curl joint. At initial contact, the talar curl joint is in neutral at 0 degrees, moving towards plantar flexion. In loading response, talar curl joint is in 5 degrees of plantar flexion, but now you're moving towards dorsiflexion. Once you get to mid stance, you're in 5 degrees of dorsiflexion, continuing to dorsiflex. Then, once you reach terminal stance, you once again have 0 degrees of plantar flexion, dorsiflexion, and you are moving toward plantar flexion. At pre-swing, you're now in 20 degrees of plantar flexion, moving towards more plantar flexion. But then, once you reach initial swing, your talar curl joint moves towards plantar flexion, but it is still 10 degrees plantar flexed. So now we will combine all 3 joints at the phases. At initial contact, you have 20 degrees of hip flexion, 0 degrees of knee extension, and 0 degrees of plantar flexion, dorsiflexion. Then as you move towards loading response, you have 15 degrees of hip flexion, 15 degrees of knee flexion, and 5 degrees of plantar flexion. At mid stance, you have 0 degrees of hip flexion, 0 degrees of knee flexion, and 5 degrees of dorsiflexion. At terminal stance, you have 5 to 10 degrees of extension of the hip, 0 degrees of flexion extension of the knee, and 0 degrees of plantar flexion, dorsiflexion at the ankle. At pre-swing, you have 5 to 10 degrees of extension at the hip, 30 degrees of flexion at the knee, and 20 degrees of plantar flexion at the ankle. At initial swing, you have 20 degrees of hip flexion, 60 degrees of knee flexion, and 10 degrees of plantar flexion.